The voice comes over the radio in the late afternoon. Northern English, flat. The Marine sergeant receiving it had spent the better part of 4 years in the most contested ground in 2 wars, and he said later that the calm was the first strange thing. Calm enough that he thought for a moment it was a joke from another element. The voice told him to halt his column, told him not to move, told him the next section of road was rigged. He halted. 300 yards ahead of his lead Marine, in the angled light of a Helmand September afternoon, 2 figures lifted slowly out of a fold in the ground that no intelligence cell had mapped and no Taliban scout had located. They wore the loose robes common to Afghan herders in that part of the valley. Between them, a long rifle. One of them had been watching the road through a scope for longer than the sergeant had been on his feet. This isn't a single documented event. It's a pattern that appears across the post-war accounts of US Marines who served in Sangin's western sector during the autumn 2010 handover period. In letters home from men describing a voice they hadn't expected and 2 figures they hadn't known were there. The names are never given. The specific dates aren't in any open-source document. The unit designation is consistently the same 3 letters. A capability described from the outside by people who experienced its output without understanding its architecture. Understanding the architecture is the point. The L115A3 is a bolt-action rifle. That detail matters more than it appears, because everything about what a sniper pair can do in a long-duration overwatch position turns on understanding what bolt action means in practice. There is no cyclic rate, no burst capability. Each round requires a separate manual action. Lift the bolt handle, pull rearward to eject the spent case. Push forward to strip a fresh round from the magazine. Press down to lock the action. From a trained operator in a supported prone position, the full cycle runs to roughly 2 seconds. What governs the pace of an engagement isn't mechanical limitation, but the deliberate process of reacquiring the next target, adjusting the firing solution for any wind change, confirming the picture, and firing. Separate aimed rounds at separate targets spread across a road junction and its flanking positions is slow, precise work. It isn't action movie work. It's arithmetic with a rifle. The weapon was introduced into the British Armed Forces in 2008 under the Sniper System Improvement Programme, replacing the L96A1 in 7.62 NATO. A platform that was losing the range competition in Helmand. Taliban PKM crews and Dragunov snipers were engaging British patrols from 800 to 1,000 metres. The 7.62 NATO round went transonic and therefore unpredictable before it reached them. The L115A3 fires the .338 Lapua Magnum, 8.59mm, a cartridge developed specifically to penetrate body armour at 1,000 metres and remains supersonic out to 1,500. The weapon weighs 6.8 kilograms unloaded. With the Schmidt and Bender PM2 scope plus bipod, suppressor and an ammunition load for an extended insertion, the system approaches 10 kilograms. The suppressor isn't a comfort measure. It reduces muzzle signature and acoustic report to the point where the firing position can't be located by audio triangulation from the target area. In a static hide above a valley floor, the difference between a suppressed and an unsuppressed shot at 1,200 yards is the difference between a position that remains concealed for the duration of the engagement and one that draws mortar fire within minutes of the first round. At the engagement ranges relevant to Sangin's approach routes, typically 600 to 1,200 yards, the L115A3 is operating well inside its designed envelope. The .338 LM round remains supersonic for the full distance. The target falls before anyone near him has identified the source of the crack, because the supersonic report of the passing round arrives before the rifle's own sound, which at that range, through a suppressor, may not arrive at all. In November 2009, Corporal of Horse Craig Harrison of the Blues and Royals established the confirmed longest sniper kills in military history in Helmand province. 3 hits at 2,474 meters, all fired from an L115A3 chambered in .338 Lapua Magnum. The targets were dead before the people beside them understood what had happened. Harrison later noted that professional snipers typically fire 1 to 3 rounds from a single position before repositioning, because repeated fire from an unknown location stops being unknown by the 3rd round. At Sangin distances, a well-concealed position on broken ground buys more tolerance than that. The sound arrives from an unexpected direction and can't easily be triangulated against what little muzzle signature the suppressor leaves. But the principle shapes the engagement. Each shot is considered. None are wasted. The second weapon in a standard British SAS sniper pair is the L121A1, the British designation for the Accuracy International AW.50. Caliber .50 BMG, 12.7 by 99 mm, anti-material. Its role is the engagement of light vehicles, equipment and hardened positions at ranges beyond the L115A3's anti-personnel capability. Elite UK Forces documentation confirms the AW.50 as a weapon used specifically by the SAS. The pairing is operationally logical. The L115A3 handles personnel at Sangin's typical engagement distances. The AW.50 provides capability against targets the .338 can't defeat. A vehicle, fortified cover, a requirement to engage at ranges the smaller rounds ballistics don't support. Carrying both weapons into a long-duration insertion adds considerably to an already significant load. The decision was made before the pair entered the ground. Operation Herrick was the UK codename for British Armed Forces operations in Afghanistan from 2002 to the end of combat in December 2014. SAS elements were in theatre from the beginning, initially providing close protection for intelligence officers and training the Afghan National Army, expanding their operational scope as the insurgency developed. By 2010, 12 UK Special Forces personnel died in Afghanistan across the year. 1 SAS officer, 3 SAS reservists, and others from supporting elements, which is confirmation of sustained combat operations without describing their structure. Sangin transferred from British to American control in September 2010. Elements of the 3rd Battalion 7th Marines arrived first. The 3rd Battalion 5th Marines followed in October. By the end of 3-5's deployment in April 2011, 29 Marines and a Navy corpsman had been killed and more than 200 wounded. The battalion described Sangin as hell on earth, which is the kind of phrase that only gets used by men who have enough comparisons to make. The formal command relationship between SAS sniper teams and specific US Marine units in Sangin's western sector isn't documented in any open source record. What reaches the surface in open source research are the effects, not the architecture. Marine NCOs encountering capabilities that hadn't been briefed to them, holding columns on roads they had been about to walk. Discovering that a stretch of ground their intelligence apparatus hadn't mapped had been occupied and observed for longer than any of their patrols. The arrangement operated at levels above the rifle company and left no accessible paperwork at the patrol base level. Marines on the ground knew what Thornton, or whichever sergeant was on the net on whichever particular afternoon, eventually learned. That when the calm northern English voice came over the radio with specific information about specific ground, something was already in motion that had started well before the column left the wire. By June 2010, The Guardian reported that more than a third of the 300 British soldiers killed in Afghanistan since 2001 had died in Sangin. The Long War Journal recorded that RCT-2 officers estimated around 100 Taliban killed in a single engagement near Sangin in late June 2010, which establishes the force density operating in that ground in the months before the handover. The Taliban had been working the approach routes of Sangin's western sector for 4 years by autumn 2010. The tactic they had refined in that time was documented, its geometry consistent, and its effectiveness measurable in the casualty statistics. The basic structure: a pressure plate IED buried in the track, victim operated, requiring no triggerman for the initial detonation. The victim's own weight closes the circuit. The blast kills or wounds the lead element and creates a casualty cluster, the surviving members gathering around the injured, calling the contact report, fixing their position while the shock and the medical requirements of a sudden mass casualty consume their attention. That clustering is what the ambush positions are waiting for. The geometry that a command-initiated variant of this tactic requires is well documented. A channeled approach route that reduces the patrol's options for movement and makes it predictable. An aiming marker at the contact point that tells the triggerman when the target is in the optimal position before detonation. Lateral direct fire positions covering the blast site, ready to engage the fixed and disrupted survivors. 3 elements. Remove any one and the entire tactic fails. Remove the triggerman and the device can't be initiated. Remove the initiation and the patrol isn't fixed. An unfixed patrol can maneuver, return fire and call close air support. The tactic only works in sequence. By autumn 2010, the Taliban had refined their reading of British patrol patterns in Sangin's western sector to the point where they knew, within tolerances, which routes would be used and at roughly what intervals. They had mined the approaches, observed the counter-IED responses, and adapted each time. Secondary devices targeting clearance teams, new emplacement techniques avoiding known vulnerability points, adjusted timing that exploited the transition period when British habits were giving way to American ones not yet established. The adaptation was continuous. The casualty rate documented its effectiveness. The one thing they couldn't adapt around was a position they didn't know existed. What follows describes a pattern of operations established in the available record of British Special Forces doctrine and practice. The specific parameters of any individual SAS insertion in Sangin's western sector in this period are outside the public domain. A sniper pair moving to a long-duration overwatch position moves at night, from an insertion point far enough from the hide that no observer could connect the 2 points. The approach route is chosen from imagery and available intelligence, avoiding high ground that would silhouette moving figures against the sky, avoiding paths that show recent human traffic, terminating at the hide entry from the direction least likely to be observed from below. Entry is made in the hours before first light, before the sky is bright enough to resolve detail, before the goat herds come out, before the first vehicles move on the valley roads. The window is narrow, it closes fast. The load is significant. The L115A3 with full ancillaries approaches 10 kilograms. The AW.50 adds considerably more. Ammunition, spotting scope, radios, water, and the items required for sustained human occupation of a 2 metre by 1 metre space. The combined load for a two-man team can reach 50 kilograms between them, divided and distributed across the pair on the approach. In September, Helmand, where daytime temperatures still reach 30 degrees Celsius, water defines the ceiling. The military standard for a soldier in moderate heat and activity is 6 litres per man per day. For a no-resupply static hold, that calculation isn't theoretical, it's the hard limit on how long the position can physically last, and it was calculated before the pair left the wire. The hide is selected against criteria that British sniper training specifies and that haven't changed in principle since Northern Ireland. Cover from view, a clear observation arc over the target ground, at least one covered withdrawal route, physical dimensions sufficient for two-man occupation. In Sangin's ridgeline terrain, this means a fold, a slight depression in otherwise unremarkable ground, the kind of feature a satellite image classifies as nothing because it's nothing that registers as significant. Not a structure, not a tree line, a fold in the earth that holds two men and everything they carry, and that looks, from any angle, like nobody's position. The bladder calculation is exactly what it sounds like. It's a practical problem with a practical answer, involving sealed containers, no movement, and the understanding that the hide works only as long as it is invisible, and it's only invisible as long as nothing moves that shouldn't move. By the third day, there is a smell that is specific and constant. It's one of the things the position carries with it, alongside the weight of the rifle and the weight of the radio, and it does not improve. The local clothing, the loose robes of an Afghan herder in that part of the valley, serves a single purpose. At first light, during the brief window of movement between the insertion point and the hide, a figure on a hillside above a Helmand valley has two possible identities to a distant observer: a shepherd or a soldier. A shepherd is ignored, a soldier is reported. The clothing makes the silhouette wrong for a soldier if the observer is at distance and the light is still thin. This is the operational logic, nothing more. The observation is the majority of the work. The engagement, when it happens, is the shortest part. British Army sniper training requires a systematic sector search as the first action when a position is occupied. The sector divides into near, middle and far ground. The search proceeds in overlapping strips using binoculars, then spotting scope, alternating between a hasty scan that catches movement and a detailed search that identifies what the movement is and what it means. Building the range card is the first sustained task. Every significant feature within engagement range plotted and ranged from the mil-dot reticle. Target height in yards multiplied by 1,000 divided by apparent height in mils gives the range. The culvert 60 metres north of the track junction. The gap in the compound wall to the west. The rising ground behind the bend in the approach, where an observation post for the ambush commander would naturally site itself. Once the range card is built, any figure appearing at a known landmark can be engaged at a confirmed distance without re-ranging. The firing solution exists before the target materializes. Eye fatigue is a real constraint. At sustained high magnification, detailed observation degrades acuity within 30 minutes. The pair rotates, observer to shooter, shooter to observer, maintaining coverage while managing the physical limits of sustained scope work in bright conditions. The rotation is smooth enough that the watch never breaks. What one set of eyes misses in the brief transition, the other confirms on the next pass. Wind in the Helmand Valley runs differently at the ridgeline than at the valley floor. The observer spends part of every observation period reading the indicators at target level: dust lifting from the track surface, the movement of sparse vegetation along the approach, smoke direction from cook fires in the compounds below. At 1,200 yards, a 5-mile-per-hour wind correction for the .338 LM round runs to approximately 6 inches of holdover. A 10-mile-per-hour correction doubles it. Getting the wind wrong by 5 miles per hour at that range misses the target by 6 inches, which may or may not be acceptable depending on where those 6 inches fall. Beyond terrain and ballistics, what a trained observer watches is behavior. Counter-IED doctrine is specific about what to look for at a command-initiated device site. The triggerman at a firing point with a clear line of sight to the contact point, oriented toward the approach, behaving in ways that don't match the pattern of life around him. A man working his fields looks at the ground in front of him and moves in rhythms dictated by the work. A man waiting to send a signal looks at the wrong horizon, at intervals that have nothing to do with farming. At 1,200 yards through a high magnification scope, the distinction between a man watching his land and a man watching a road is visible in the angle of his head and the direction of his attention. It isn't inference, it's observation. The lateral positions for a Sangin ambush, inside compound walls, in low ground to either side of the approach, elevated ground behind the junction, reveal themselves by the same method. The position that is covered from the road but open toward the approach. The barrel visible through the gap in the upper course of a wall. The figure in a ditch whose orientation makes no sense for a farmer at that hour. Each confirmed position goes onto the range card. Each gets a firing solution. The picture assembles across hours of systematic watching, and by the time a column appears around the bend in the approach, the observer on the ridgeline has more detailed knowledge of what is waiting for that column than anyone in the column's own command structure. The decision point, when to warn, when to engage, isn't formalized in open-source doctrine for this specific scenario. The operational logic is clear enough. If the column can be halted before it enters the kill zone, the triggerman's device never fires, the ambush sequence never initiates, and the lateral teams expose themselves for nothing. The warning comes first. Engagement follows only when warning is insufficient or when the situation deteriorates past the point where a halt alone resolves it. The cold-bore shot, the first round from a barrel that hasn't been warmed by prior firing, is the one professional snipers track most carefully. An unfired barrel has a slightly different harmonic profile than one that has absorbed heat and residue from previous rounds. For a well-maintained L115A3, the cold-bore impact should print consistently with the confirmed 0. But a prepared sniper logs cold-bore data for each specific weapon under field conditions. That data was established before the insertion. He knows where the first round goes. At 1,200 yards, the .338 LM round remains supersonic for the full distance. The triggerman at his firing point, oriented toward the approach road, sees nothing. The people near him hear the supersonic crack of the passing round, a sharp, distinctive report that precedes the rifle's own sound, before they can orient on the source. The bolt cycles. A new round chambers. The observer calls the next priority. The sequence work through the ambush's remaining elements in the order the range card has established as priority. The lateral position with the clearest field of fire on the approach track, because that is the greatest immediate threat to a halted column. Then its partner, then whatever remains. Each round is preceded by its own wind check, its own target confirmation against the range card, its own adjustment for what the observer reports between shots. The observer calls and corrects, while the sniper cycles and reacquires. 2 people, 1 system. And the system works because the communication between them has been reduced, through practice, to the minimum necessary. Not silence exactly, the minimum. Without the IED detonating, the ambush loses its initiator. The lateral positions, built to exploit a fixed and disrupted patrol, find themselves in covered ground with no tactical purpose. The patrol is still mobile, still capable of fire and maneuver. Without the triggering detonation, the rational response from an exposed position is to hold and remain undetected, or to withdraw. The ambush geometry the Taliban had built in that section of ground, maintained across months of preparation, calibrated to the approach routes of Sangin's western sector, fails at.